Hello guys, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be going through sort of the evolution of the hoplite from the Mycenaeans all the way to Alexander the Great and see what they become as we go through the ages. So really when we can first sort of talk about hoplites is the Bronze Age, where the Mycenaeans settle in Greece. This was about from 3300 BC to 1200 BC is sort of the time period that we are talking about. So I have some examples here of the armour that the Mycenaean warriors would be wearing, and as you can see it's very crude, but yet it's also extremely intelligent and it's very well armoured. It's very similar, actually, to some later 14th, 15th century, 16th century medieval style armour, even from the Pauljans especially. And though it does look quite crude in some of these pictures, quite roughly thrown together, as you can see there is very elaborate designs and extremely well put together pieces of armour. Now, one thing that I also find incredibly interesting here is that they actually have horned helmets, some of them, not all of them. And I find it interesting that Vikings seem to be the stereotypical horned helmets, when historically that never happened. Now, these are the type of warriors that you would see during the Trojan Wars, so not like the movie Troy, where they're very sort of classical or archaic inspired Greeks. There's another full suit of the armour, so they were pretty much entirely covered. Now, they had a variety of different shield types, but lots of them were quite rounded. Some of them even coated in bronze, and others had some sort of ox hide or some sort of leathery coating over them. So the armour that I just showed you is called Dendra armour, and the weapons that they would use as well during this time would be bronze swords and spears. And actually the swords that you see, they have when they're well made, they're incredibly well made and they're incredibly elaborate, and they are extremely advanced for especially the time period that we think of. Now, this was also before the Greek Dark Ages, which is why the next era which we're going to be going into, which is called the Geometric era, isn't quite as advanced as the Bronze Age or the Mycenaeans. So the Greek Dark Ages happened from about 1100 BC to about 750 BC. And the Geometric era warrior was from 900 BC to about 700 BC. So these guys were essentially in the Greek Dark Ages. Now, the armour that they had here was not as advanced as the Mycenaeans. Their helmet, funnily enough, was basically an early prototype for the Illyrian helmet, which was actually a later Greek helmet. So they didn't really wear too much armour. This here is an example of some of the armour or some of the clothing that the Geometric era hoplites would be wearing. Now, unfortunately, as this is in the Greek Dark Ages, we don't know nearly as much about how they fought here or really how effective they were. We do, however, know that they, again, had a quite typically rounded shield and actually quite typically depicted with swords, which is quite interesting. They did still have spears, but this era sort of, as I said, as it is the Dark Ages, we don't know as much about it, but it does seem to show more swords being used than in other eras of hoplite warfare. Now, coming out of the Geometric era, we come into one of my favourite eras of history, the Ancient Greek Archaic era. Now, this was about 600 BC to 500 BC, and 500 BC is basically my favourite time period for Greece, around that period. Now, this is really where we can see the hoplite that we think of today really start to emerge. So here's some examples of the armour that they'd be wearing in the Archaic era. So this one is actually a Spartan Archaic breastplate, and this is a recreation from the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. So this is apparently a Spartan Archaic, and I think what the difference is between that cuirass that he's wearing there is a bell cuirass, and it has the abs. I think that's sort of what makes it a Spartan style. But as we can see, it quite heavily armoured again, from arm armour to thigh armour to even foot armour. And the helmets that they would be wearing typically in this time is the very early styled Corinthian helmet, and this is sort of where the J crest, which if you don't know the J crest, is the crest that sort of comes up and curves forward. I did a whole video on it, the origin of ancient Greek crests, which perhaps I'll link up on the top or in the description. Now, also, they are quite commonly depicted to have groin flaps as well, and these guys were essentially knights of the Archaic era. This is also where the aspis, the hoplite shield, we can for sure know was used, with the argive grip and the domed shape, and this is sort of really where the hoplite of classical Greece really starts to form. Now, the Archaic era hoplites once again carried the dory, which was the double-ended hoplite spear, and either a xiphos or a kopis style sword. But one thing that also makes these different from the classical or slightly later period hoplites is they actually also carried a smaller spear or a javelin that was used for throwing. This did sort of go out of fashion basically at the Greco-Persian Wars, which was quite interesting. As to why they decided to drop the javelin. One thing as well with the Archaic era is that they weren't quite as anatomically correct armor suits. And what I mean by that is that the bell cuirass obviously isn't quite as realistic as the later muscle cuirass, and their greaves were also not muscled nearly as much. Some of them were, but not quite as realistic as the Archaic era, as the classical era, sorry. These here are an example of some earlier Archaic style greaves, and as you can see they are quite smooth and not as sort of cool looking, I suppose, as the later anatomical greaves. Now, as far as we know as well, this is also sort of where the linothorax starts to come in, or the Greek tube and yoke style armors, or the spolas as well. And also towards the end of the Archaic era, the famous bronze muscle cuirass starts to sort of overcome the bell cuirass. However, the bell cuirass was still in use, and for actually quite a long period of time. So now we come into my personal favourite time period of Greece, which is the early classical period, which is about 500 BC. This helmet here is an example of what an early classical helmet, Corinthian helmet would be. So it still has a closed ear and not quite as open as later models of the Corinthian helmet become. Now this is the type of hoplite that we'll be fighting in the Greco-Persian Wars and also the start of the Peloponnesian Wars. So this is where the linothorax or the spolas or tube and yoke, whatever you want to call them, really started to kick off in Greece. The Corinthian helmets evolved to, or not just Corinthian helmets there, Greek helmets evolved to open up the ears so they could hear, and invariably the cheek guards as well. The muscle cuirass now completely overtook the bell cuirass, and the bell cuirass is sort of back in the archaic times. The thigh and the arm armour has now been lost, and so has the javelin. Now, what a wealthy hoplite from this time period would have would be a helmet, an aspis, most likely a bronze-coated aspis if we're talking Spartans as well. Also, if they could afford it, greaves, and either a xiphos or a kopis, or of course the dory as well. Now, one thing that I also really like about ancient Greeks is their unique designs and sort of artistic influence on their armour. Now, I will do a separate video on this, but their shield blazons as well are heavily customised, more so in the archaic and classical eras than any other period, as we know, because, as I said, we lost a lot through the Greek Dark Ages. But really, this is where the prime of the hoplite really comes in. So the phalanx had been developed and perfected over the Archaic era, as the phalanx was invented around 700 BC-ish, give or take. And yeah, this is where the hoplite was really sort of saw its prime, though they were actually less armoured than their previous Archaic era hoplites. Now, as we go into the Peloponnesian Wars, things start to change as war is inevitable, and funnily enough, the Spartans, which were basically the most heavily armoured of all Greeks, throughout the Archaic and Classical era start to sort of see a decline in their armour and favour the Pylos type helmet, which is more of a cone shape. It's also shown as well that many of them lost armour and were just fighting in tunics, and this is where, again, Sparta is an extremely complicated city-state, as they had Perioikoi, Helots, and Homoioi fighting at the same time. This is also the time period where the lambda comes onto the shields for Spartans. However, there's lots of debate whether the Homoioi Spartans, and there's also supposedly Moras as well, which are essentially groups, like essentially Spartan legions that would all have shield designs, but it's all over the place, and lots of people can't really settle on what was fact and what wasn't, though it's possible that why the typical Spartan hoplite, and this time because the Homoioi population had decreased significantly, especially over the earthquake that happened in I think 464 BC, around there. So it's possible that the Perioikoi Spartans were the less armoured ones and also then made up more of the Spartan army, and that's why. But what we see here is a very lightly armoured hoplite, and really isn't what we think of with hoplites, with the typical Corinthian helmets and heavily armoured infantry that they were. And for the final one that we're going here is the Lacedonian Hippospist. This is an advanced unit from Alexander's army, and though this isn't a hoplite anymore, this is sort of what happened to the hoplite around the time period of Alexander the Great, which the Hippospist basically was around the 4th century BC. They would typically wear a Thracian helmet, muscle cuirass, greaves, a rounded shield, and a dory as well. So still not the Macedonian pike phalanx, but still very resemblant of the hoplite. So that is basically how the hoplite itself evolved from the Bronze Age all the way to the Classical. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it and learned some stuff from it. And please like and subscribe if you did, all of that typical YouTube mumbo jumbo. And if you want to check out some other videos, there will be one coming up in just a second. Thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.